my colleague Ali Abu Nama, the executive director of Electronic Intifada, earlier this year, he was visiting Switzerland and he was invited there by Palestine solidarity groups who organized a speaking event for him. And he was then effectively kidnapped off the streets by ununiformed plainclothes people who turned out to be immigration police, I believe, of the Zurich canton of Switzerland. And then what happened? He was held without charge for 3 days and then released and deported, immediately deported from Switzerland.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. I'm Ileana and my co-host is Fiona Edwards. Every week on this podcast, we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission of building a global movement to promote peace and challenge the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. So please subscribe, comment, share our videos. We are trying to encourage people to become Patreon members. So we will be putting the first part of this interview on YouTube, but you can watch the full episode on Patreon. So please subscribe and become a member, and full audio podcasts will be available every Saturday on Spotify and Amazon Music.
So today we're really happy to introduce a great guest onto our podcast, The Global Majority for Peace, Asa Winstanley. Asa is an investigative journalist, an author, and an associate editor at the Electronic Intifada. His Substack is called Palestine is the Issue. Welcome, Asa.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
So glad to have you on, Asa. We like to begin our podcast with a little bit of a personal note. Could we start with you telling us about the origin of your politicization? Was there a particular incident that led you to your worldview?
Yeah, well, I was brought up quite religious and came from a religious family, and both my grandfathers were very strong. Well, they were both ministers, Christian ministers, and they were both conscientious objectors. So, I'm not really religious anymore, but there was always a strain of pacifism in my religious background and in my family. And so in my 20s, I became involved in the anti-war movement. And I got involved in just in, my own little way, going to demonstrations and stuff like that against the war in Afghanistan and then the impending war in Iraq. And I moved to London, having, only recently moved to London when the so-called War on Terror started. I grew up in South Wales. That's where I'm from. And yeah, I went to a lot of those demonstrations. And what I found really interesting was there was always, and what was like a bit of a eye-opener for me, was there was always Palestinian flags on those demonstrations, although they were about Afghanistan and Iraq. Of course, it was like 2001, 2002, 2003. So the second Intifada was happening in Palestine at the time. And so I would just wonder in my own way, like, well, what is this about? And I just started a process of self-education, basically, about it. And I started reading books and reading news more and going to meetings and lectures. And eventually I joined an activist group called the International Solidarity Movement, which goes on solidarity visits to the West Bank and Gaza, although I never went to Gaza personally. But I lived on and off for 2 years in the West Bank between 2005 and 2007, and then visited many times after that. And I got more and more involved in the media side of that activism because, no one really wants to do the writing up of the report and that. So, because I was a long-term activist there, I ended up doing that kind of stuff and editing other people's reports and posting them to the website. And I guess I'd always really wanted to be a journalist anyway as a child, but then, disillusioned with maybe that's not quite the right word, never liking in the first place British journalism, being pretty much the worst journalism in the world. So that's kind of how I got my start in journalism, and I'm a sort of movement journalist. That's kind of how I refer to myself. I'm an investigative journalist rather than an activist per se, although because I'm not involved in organizing per se. And so, yeah, that's kind of my background, I guess.
Well, thanks very much for that introduction to who you are. I'm sure a lot of our listeners are, really keen to get your assessment on what's going on at the moment. So we're a year and a half into the US-Israeli genocide on Gaza, but in many ways, the media cycle has moved on from this issue. Can you give us an assessment of how it is going and your thoughts on the most recent ceasefire proposal?
The Western media landscape is just really, really depressing. Like ever since the start of the genocide, it's been, at best indifferent and at worst actively complicit and actively involved in genocide, in covering up for Israel, and especially for the British state's involvement in the genocide in terms of the spy flights that the RAF is flying over Gaza, providing intelligence to Israel to help them annihilate the Palestinian people. I mean, I've said the way I've described the ceasefire negotiations is a ceasefire process. It's a kind of endless. It's like the so-called peace process where they say, well, we're trying to negotiate a peace, but actually it's a sort of never-ending process for its own sake in order to really distract attention from the genocide that's happening, and it's kind of cover for the genocide. The only exception really to that being the 2-month ceasefire that we had at the start of this year before it was, sabotaged once again by Israel and ended unilaterally by Israel. So yeah, it's very bleak. Like that's the current situation. They're annihilating the Palestinian people in Gaza with the active involvement of Western nations and often with the active involvement even with the media. With Trump in power, Trump is a very sort of erratic actor. And so the reality is that it was the Trump administration who forced Israel to have a ceasefire, the ceasefire that ended up being temporary, but was supposed to be carried on into a second and third phase. So, there are some indications here and there. We were discussing it in our Electronic Intifada live stream last week. There are some possible indications here and there that there could be another ceasefire, but it's very hard to say. Trump has got all these kind of competing factors behind him. He's such a sort of unpredictable actor that it's hard to say. But essentially, the last ceasefire proposal that I saw was essentially the same thing that the Israelis have been saying all along, which is a non-ceasefire ceasefire. Basically, the Palestinian fighters release the captive Israelis, we call it a ceasefire, and then go back to fighting after the Israeli captives are released. So it's a nonsense. It's not really a ceasefire that they're wanting to have. And it's really just a way to get back their prisoners from the Palestinian fighters in holding them in Gaza and then go back to eradicating the civilian population of the Gaza Strip. And, calling that a ceasefire is nonsensical. And so the armed Palestinian factions led by Hamas have basically stood by the fact that the principle of it being a condition of the prisoner exchange to end the war. That's what they're sticking by. And that's what was agreed in January. And the Israelis ended that, which is why they ended the prisoner exchanges. So that's kind of the current situation where we're at. There is some indications as well. The primary factor, there could possibly still be a ceasefire. And the factor that why there was even the temporary ceasefire for 2 months is that very simply, although Israel is carrying out a genocide, it is also losing a war at the same time. My colleague at the Electronic Intifada, Ileana, put it this way, that Israel has this in common with the Nazis and Adolf Hitler, that they were carrying out a genocide at the same time as losing a war. Israel's very good at killing civilians. It's very good at bombing civilians from the air and just death and destruction, but it's not very good at actual fighting of soldiers between combatants. When they do that, in the very limited cases where they do that, where they're confronted on the ground by Palestinian fighters in Gaza, they tend to lose quite quickly. The reality is that the Palestinian fighters in Gaza have been fighting them to a standstill to the point where the Israelis are facing an internal collapse of the Israeli military. That's a big reason for the ceasefire. This is a massively underreported story. It's barely reported. I mean, you do see it in the Israeli press somewhat, and we try and bring it out. But there is an absolute rash at the moment of effectively desertions, refusal to fight, refusal to return to Gaza. And these are not like moral. It's not like, hundreds and hundreds of Israeli soldiers are like refusing to fight because they suddenly got a conscience. No, that's not it. It's just they're sick of seeing their fellow Israeli soldiers being killed and coming back with trauma and so forth and mental breakdown. So, the Israelis are facing the Israeli military, especially, but also the Israeli economy. They're facing the prospect of potential internal collapse. They're not there yet, but the more and more desertions that happen, the more it makes it difficult for them to carry on with a new round of fighting in the Gaza Strip. So that's why they keep withdrawing and they keep going back to aerial bombardment. So we can't rule out the prospect that there will be another ceasefire, but we also can't rule out the prospect there'll just be this grinding genocide just carrying on and on for it just seems like it's endless now.
Yeah, this is such a weird contradiction because at the same time, we're seeing a regional escalation, aren't we? I mean, we had the recent attacks on Yemen, the near attack
Mm.
on Iran, and I think that brings us back to what you were saying about Trump. He's so volatile and somewhat unpredictable in that on one hand, with the bombing of Yemen, there was this distraction of this ridiculous signal chat controversy with Pete Hegseth, right? So there's that, but then there's the reality that they did bomb Yemen. And then with the near attack on Iran, there is talk about him being the one that stopped that.
Mm.
So all these contradictions are happening. Can you sort of break down whether or not this really does mark a difference from Biden? And what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, what I mean by Trump has all these competing factors. I mean, I think ultimately Trump's only principle is, and his only commitment is to Trump and his own self-preservation. Whereas you could say the Democratic Party establishment, Joe Biden, to the extent that he was even, conscious and capable of any sort of thought, which I think he wasn't really by the end, was very, very dedicated to the furtherance of US imperial interests, and specifically with Biden and Antony Blinken to Zionism, to the project of Zionism, to the project of colonizing Palestinian land, to driving out Palestinians in order to replace them with Jewish settlers from the West. That is the project of Zionism. And they were very, very ideologically committed to that. Antony Blinken, after the October the 7th offensive, he went and visited with Netanyahu and said, I'm not here as an American, I'm here as a Jew. That was his words, pretty much word for word. Don't have the quote in front of me, but that was the way he put it. And so that is a very deep ideological commitment to Zionism. Whereas I think the Trump administration is a bit more split. It definitely has those ideological Zionists within it, but more from the Christian Zionist, religious fundamentalist tendency, where they have this sort of end times theology and whatnot, of the quote unquote the Jews returning and all of this stuff before Jesus can come back, etc. But they also have a neoliberal element in terms of just the extreme Islamophobia and whatnot. But then they also have a kind of nativist element, which is becoming increasingly more skeptical of Israel in term not in a moral way of they're killing people, although even that exists on the right, has to be said, in the US, even the far right, or elements of it, but more of the idea that it is actually America first, not Israel first. So that does exist as well within elements that are sort of has Trump's ears. But over all of this as well, of course, his main funder is Miriam Adelson, who is the widow, an Israeli multi-billionaire, who the widow of the late Sheldon Adelson, who was this casino magnate. And for many, many years, I mean, I've written about it. They funded and still fund the Israel lobby in America. They're one of the main financial backers of the Israel lobby in America. Sheldon Adelson is passed away now, but Miriam, his widow, is still carrying on with that commitment, and she definitely has Trump's ear as his main financial backer. But at the same time, he's not. He doesn't seem to be completely beholden to her. Otherwise, I think he would have probably attacked Iran already because it's pretty clear that's something she wants. So it's hard to know like what the internal discourse is sometimes with this kind of stuff because it's hard to say like why she seemed to, or at least kind of allowed to happen, I suppose. She didn't pull out her funding, seemed to want the temporary ceasefire to happen. Was it just a case of, well, we are facing these problems within the Israeli military and we need time to rearm? Was that the thinking? I'm not sure. But it is interesting in terms of the fact that the Trump administration has these contradictions within it.
Well, just carrying on about, the situation of Trump and how that's impacting the situation in relation to Israel. Just wanted to kind of zoom in on something, obviously one of the biggest initiatives that Trump has undertaken since he's come into office this year is the tariff war. We've seen, countries scrambling for new trade deals and alignments, and this is even amongst very staunch allies of the United States. And I just wanted your reflections on, how you think this is affecting the West's support for Israel. Is it having any impact?
It doesn't seem to be like the West's support for Israel in terms of the government and the powers. It just seems to be absolute, and it seems like it will carry on forever. But everything seems impossible until it's not, I suppose. It's pretty much a truism, I suppose. But
Nelson
it's
Mandela said that, didn't he? Yeah,
yeah,
it's impossible till it's
exactly. I
done.
mean, it is very, very true. The apartheid regime seemed like it was going to be in place forever, and then all of a sudden it started disintegrating very quickly. And so I do think we could see something similar happen in Palestine with the Israeli regime. I think that what has been interesting about the whole tariff battle it's just kind of a sign of how erratic the Trump administration is. And I suppose it kind of gives me hope in the sense that he doesn't seem particularly bright because he's sort of saying, well, we're going to impose all these tariffs on our allies, we're going to impose all these tariffs on China, and then a few days later, sort of climbing down. So that, for me, gives me a little bit of hope in the sense that, he's saying after the ceasefire the Israelis dropped the ceasefire, ended the ceasefire unilaterally in Gaza. He enabled that by saying, Hamas has to release the hostages, otherwise we're going to unleash hell in Gaza, etc. And, they have continued to unleash hell. That's definitely true. But at the same time, I suppose the whole climb down with the towers gives me a little bit of hope that maybe they could still go back to the ceasefire.
A recent paper from the Watson Institute of Brown University found that the genocide in Gaza has, since October 7th, killed more journalists than the US Civil War, World War I and II, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, including the conflicts in Cambodia and Laos, the wars in Yugoslavia in the 1990s and 2000s, and the post 9/11 war in Afghanistan combined.
Mm.
Can you help us unpack what has been happening and what this means for journalism as a whole?
I mean, when you put it like that, it is just absolutely astonishing, the hundreds of journalists that they've killed in Gaza. And I think what that is a sign of is that it shows you that it is a genocide, that it's a Holocaust. Some people say that it's too provocative to describe it as a Holocaust, but to me, in my view, that is literally what we're seeing. Like the word Holocaust for a mass killing predates even the word genocide, and it predates the Nazi Holocaust of the Jews during World War II. And the literal meaning is of a kind of burning, a mass burning, and that is literally what we're seeing in Gaza, that they're targeting these civilian tents in the so-called safe areas and just burning civilians en masse in these tents. It's a mass genocide. So, like, the targeting, it's not only the targeting of journalists. What the sign of the systemic targeting of journalists shows that it is a genocide, that it is deliberately targeted at the civilian population and not Hamas. Like, it's not. Yeah, they are targeting Hamas as well, but like the primary target is the people. Hamas just happens to be trying to fight that, physically fight that. The target, they're saying it openly. They want the removal of the Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Quite early on in the genocide, there was even an Israeli army officer who went on CNN and went on American television and said that he said it explicitly. He said the target is not Hamas, the target is all the civilians. He said it. That was his words in English. I believe it was October the 9th, 2023. The Israeli so-called defense minister, Yoav Gallant, he's now the former defense minister, but at the time, what he said on October the 9th was, "We're fighting human animals. There's going to be no more food, water, fuel, anything when we're fighting human animals." And he didn't say Hamas are the human animals. He didn't say Palestinian terrorists are the human animals. He was talking about the whole of the Gaza Strip. He was talking about all Palestinians in Gaza. And so the fact that so many journalists have been killed shows that what they're saying is true to the reality of what they're actually doing, which is to systematically destroy and murder as much as possible. The population in general. I know that it's not about the fighters. It's not about the so-called terrorists per se. It's about the population. It's about removing and killing the non-Jewish population because Zionism is an ethno-religious racist ideology. It's the ideology of what many groups have called Jewish supremacy because it's a kind of racial ideology. It's a settler colonial ideology. It's not unique to, in many ways, to settler colonial ideologies because that's what they do. I mean, look at North America where they wiped out the indigenous population there as well. I suppose that one of the main differences is that it came later, it started in the late 19th century in Palestine. So, it is a sign of that. I mean, you compare it as well to the special military operation, the Russian, invasion of Ukraine. Russia's military power could have done far more. They could have wiped out the civilian population in Ukraine as well. But the ideology was different. They wanted a country and a people to be intact because most of the Ukrainian people in the southeast of Ukraine consider themselves to be Russians. And so, they wanted to have a country intact. Whereas the Israelis don't want the Palestinians to be there. That's the bottom line. And they don't want them to exist, essentially. And so that's what they're carrying out. And they're using this kind of cover of, well, we're targeting terrorists. But there's many, many times where they don't even bother with that cover. And so the eradication of Palestinian journalists is one symptom of that because they were also trying to eradicate Palestinian doctors. They're trying to eradicate the next generation of Palestinians. They're targeting health. My colleague at the Electronic Intifada, Nora Barrows-Friedman, has done so many interviews with health workers in Gaza trying to survive under this genocide. And it's the same thing, they're going after all of the institutions and all of the infrastructure and all of the human resources that make up a society and that contribute towards the survival of society. And so journalists are a big part of that because, of course, they've also stopped Western journalists from entering the Gaza Strip entirely stopped them with one or two exceptions, as long as they were embedded with Israeli military forces. But even that didn't seem to last very long. And they are deliberately targeting Palestinian journalists. And they've done it before, even before this genocide started. In the West Bank as well, Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in 2022 in Jenin. She was shot dead deliberately by an Israeli army sniper. It was reconstructed by experts, and they figured out where the shooting was coming from. The soldier shooting her, this Palestinian journalist, who incidentally also had American citizenship, Shireen Abu Akleh, he would have been able to see who she was, see her press vest. So it was a very deliberate, targeted assassination of somebody who was kind of, I mean, she was very, very famous in the Arab world, like as an Al Jazeera correspondent in the West Bank. She was a Palestinian herself, and the level of her fame within the Arab world, you'd have to compare her to someone, I don't know, someone like K80 or someone like that, who would be a household name across the whole region, essentially. And they deliberately did it, they deliberately did it. And then they made up all these lies afterwards. And they've never been held to account for that. And so of course, they're going to carry on doing that. And the Palestinian journalists in Gaza, especially, are paying for that lack of accountability with their lives. It's very depressing situation. We've got so many colleagues who have had to flee. We've got colleagues who have been in Gaza have been killed. So this is the reality of genocide.
I mean, the attack that you just outlined on Palestinian genocide in this period has been the most extreme, a really central element of this genocide. But there's also been just a worldwide attack on journalism throughout this whole period as well. And you have found yourself in the crosshairs of that yourself, as well as other colleagues at Electronic Intifada, including your editor. So I
Mm.
was just wondering if you could talk us through what has happened and update us on your current circumstances as well.
Well, I'll explain what happened to Ali first. So my colleague Ali Abu Nama, the executive director of Electronic Intifada, earlier this year, he was visiting Switzerland and he was invited there by Palestine Solidarity groups who organized a speaking event for him. And he was then effectively kidnapped off the streets by ununiformed plainclothes people who turned out to be immigration police, I believe, of the Zurich canton of Switzerland. And then what happened? He was held without charge for 3 days and then released and immediately deported from Switzerland. It was strange because they said that, he'd violated, they seemed to be saying anyway, because there was no charges, but they seemed to be saying that he was banned from the country, but what they let him in legally. So what had actually happened was they banned him from the country after his entry, after there was a kind of hit job against him in the German language Swiss press. Anyway, that's essentially what happened. Luckily he was out after 3 days and he is kind of fighting that. He's fighting that at the moment. I don't think I can say much more about that at the moment, but there will be more to say about it in the future. But it was quite explicitly done over his political views. It was over his views and over his reporting. That's what it's about. And in the Swiss press, when he was sort of defamed, that was essentially confirmed. What happened to me was different because it happened here in Britain, in London, where I live and where I'm a citizen of, but it kind of has the same root in the sense that it was all about my journalism, it was all about my reporting, and all about the fact that I oppose what the Israelis have done to the Palestinians and what they are doing to the Palestinians. So what happened was it was the 17th of October last year, and the police came and raided my home at 10 to 6 in the morning, so it was still dark, and they banged on the door, rang the doorbell, and they shouted at police, let us in. So yeah, it was a raid, and what they did was they searched the whole house. They said at the end of about 3 hours, they took all my devices, they took all my computers and phones that I use for my journalism specifically, and they made it very clear that, it wasn't a case of mistaken identity, that they knew I was a journalist, and they asked me specifically which devices I use for my journalism, and they wanted that to be known. I mean, it seemed to me like a fishing expedition, right? Because obviously the ones I use for my journalism, I'm going to have my files on there, my notes, my contacts, all my details with all my sources. And so to me, this was very dangerous and really endangering to my sources, both here and in Palestine. And they did have a warrant. In my case, they had a warrant to search my home and my vehicle. And on that paperwork they handed me also had a covering letter, and that covering letter stated, "We're aware of your profession." So they were stating in writing that they know I'm a journalist, and that, under British law, I should have the right to, and in fact, the duty to protect my sources as a journalist. But they were fully aware of my profession, fully aware of the fact I'm a journalist. They took all my computers and phones, and they still hold them to this day. And I wasn't charged with anything. I wasn't even arrested, actually. I mean, I suppose I was effectively detained within my home for a few hours, but I wasn't arrested and I wasn't charged with anything. What it said on the warrant was that they suspect that I may have violated one of Britain's anti-terror laws, or terror, they're actually called terror acts, terrorism acts, and may have been guilty of supporting a prescribed organization, but they haven't charged me with that yet. So we'll see. There's ongoing legal efforts, and my lawyers are trying to get my devices back and stop the police accessing them, searching them, and endangering my sources. So that's as much as I can say about that for now. I was aware of the possibility that it could happen, right? Because people that I've been reporting on, it's happened to them before me. I've been reporting on groups like Palestine Action, which take direct action against Israeli arms firms in this country. It just seemed like it was getting closer and closer, and that it would be possible that, it could happen to me too. But when then it actually did happen, it's very it has an impact on you, and I think that's part of the intended effect is to make this, because even now as I'm speaking, I'm sort of trying to watch what I say a little bit because I have to be careful about what I say. Yeah, so and I think it's meant to have that effect, that chilling effect, and it's meant to stop activists and it's meant to stop journalists from reporting on this. The latest that's come out about this came out this week. There's been a report in The Guardian, and emails obtained by a Freedom of Information request from Palestine Action's lawyers, actually. And it was reported in The Guardian, and I posted on my Twitter X account one of the emails from September last year. So a month before I was raided, the Attorney General's office emailed the Deputy Israeli Ambassador following up from a meeting they'd had. Now, we don't know exactly what she said, this person from the Attorney General's office, but because most of the email is redacted, right? It's almost all redacted, actually. But crucially, they forgot to redact the subject line, and the subject line says contact details CPS SO15. So what that means is Crown Prosecution Service, which is obviously, the Britain's public prosecutions, the government prosecutions office, but it's still supposed to be, independent. And SO15 is the counter-terrorism command of the Metropolitan Police. So the so-called counter anti-terror squad, which raided my home and has raided the homes of other journalists and activists in Britain over the last year or so. So you have the Attorney General's office sending the contact details to the Israeli embassy of this counter-terror squad, which is then raiding activists and journalists who focus on Palestine, and that the Israeli government would definitely like to see in prison. So you see this kind of collusion between political, but the Attorney General's office is meant to be, it is a political appointment, that they are then encouraging the Israelis to name people, it seems. What is the contents of that redacted email? We don't know yet, but it seems, the subtext there, it seems that they are encouraging the Israelis to say, yeah, you need to arrest this person, you need to arrest that person. And that's quite kind of similar to what's been happening in the US as well, with people being basically effectively kidnapped off the streets. Student campaigners quite often being effectively kidnapped off the streets by immigration police. And we see quite often that the names being put forward for this are from these pro-Israel groups, from these Israel lobby groups, or these, Zionist activist groups. That's publicly who the names are being put forward by. But what this email suggests, and what other facts that have come out in the US suggest, are that actually it's Israel itself that are putting forward these kinds of names. Because these pro-Israel groups anyway, many of them are often coordinated with the state of Israel itself. And the Israel lobby works very, very closely with the actual state of Israel itself. And so, we see the kind of collusion by a hostile foreign power.
Thank you for watching the first part of our interview. Please head over to patreon.com/Empire Watch to watch the full episode. The podcast is also available as an audio on Spotify and Amazon Music every Saturday.